Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a very famous rook endgame, and this endgame is called the Vancura position. Now, the Vancura position got its name from Joseph Vancura, a player who studied this about 100 years ago, and the Vancura position is kind of an essential drawing technique that you must know if you're the side defending. If say you're down a pawn and you can't hold on to the position in passive defense, you have to start thinking actively, and the Vancura position is just that. Here's how it works. The idea is that you have to cut the king off from helping to promote the pawn. So if we look at a position such as this, we can see that black is down a pawn, but the problem for white is that white's rook is occupying the square where the pawn essentially will promote at. And of course, if black plays nothing reasonable, and if he just allows this white king to just come up the board like this, and then hide in a7, probably play something like rook b8, rook b7, maybe king a8. You get the idea. The pawn will easily be escorted, and after the simple king to b8, sliding the king over, black will eventually have to give up his own rook, and that'll simply be it. White is up a rook, and he can easily win. So black has to play a bit actively in a position like this. And it's white to move here, and white plays king f3. Of course, he's trying to achieve the goal. So here, black plays this rook f1 check. And this is an essential move because black needs to be able to occupy the 6th rank. And if it's white to play, if it was white who was down a pawn, then it would be the 3rd rank. So rook f1 check, and after king to e4, black now plays rook to f6. He needs to find a way to control the whole 6th rank so white's king cannot really approach the pawn that easily. So white plays king d5, rook g6, let's say making a waiting move, king c4, and now rook f6. And now white has two options. He can either play king to b5 or a7. Both are still a drawn position, but it only depends on whether black knows how to draw the position. So here, let's say that the move a7 is played. So a7, then black needs to get behind the pawn. There is no other move. If black plays something slow, like, I don't know, king to h7, then white will take this opportunity to play rook h8 check, and after the king grabs the rook, white will just queen, and this is a simple winning game. Of course, white will have to work a bit, but after a while, a queen versus a rook, this is easily winning. So what does black do? I mean, it seems that he's losing, but black will just put his rook on a6. And this is essential because you need to guard the a8 square. And now the rook cannot move and threaten the pawn to queen, because wherever the rook moves, you'll either capture the pawn, or maybe if the rook moves to a wrong square, you'll capture the rook. So here, king b5, trying to chase the rook away from the a file. If the rook moves away from the a file, then that's simply done for black. So black will play rook to a1, drawing his rook as far away from the king as possible. And again, white cannot move his rook to somewhere like g8, because the pawn can't queen, because the rook is guarding it. So you can't maybe force something like rook g8 check and then queen. So white will play king b6, getting ready to play king b7, rook b8, just something like this. And the king will find shelter on this a8 square. The rook will come to b7, the king will come to b8, and in the end, black will eventually have to give up his rook for this a7 pawn. So here, rook b1 check by black. Now you start checking the king. And if you have understood maybe these types of endgames, white is completely winning here. If black maybe makes a mistake like king to f7, say in a position like this, if rook a1 and let's say king to c5, and let's say that black does not know the endgame and he plays something like king f7, this is of course a hypothetical scenario, but if king f7 is played, then black is able to play this rook h8 move. And this rook h8 move is very common in rook endgames, where it's threatening to skewer, because the point is that if black takes the pawn, then rook h7 and the rook is lost, and there's nothing else to do. If you say play something like maybe rook a2, then the pawn will simply queen, and that's practically it. So the king has to stay on the squares g7 and h7. So after rook a1, the king now goes to b6. We again established that the king cannot go anywhere. So now rook b1 check. You have to start checking the king. King c7 check. And now you bring the rook back when the king is not defending the pawn anymore. When the king isn't defending the pawn, it's okay to bring the rook back. But as soon as the king comes in contact with the pawn, meaning that as soon as it's able to defend the pawn, you have to start checking. You have no other option. So you will check, put the rook back on a1, and it's basically a draw. If white wants to repeat, then he can repeat, but he won't gain anything. So this is essentially a drawn endgame. Now let's look at another scenario where after this, king b5 is played. Now, after king b5 is played, you have no other choice. You have to start checking. If otherwise, you'll just allow this a7 idea, and then after, say, something like rook to b8, maybe if you play something like rook f5 then there's perhaps a chance of king b6 and all that. But really, the main threat here is rook b8 and then rook b6, trying to get the king up the board, maybe to this rank. And the point is that it'll be an easy win after that. So rook f5 check, you need to start checking the king. King c6, rook f6 check, king d5, rook f5 check, king e6. And once the king is far away from the pawn as possible, then you bring the rook back to b6. And the rook will just constantly be monitoring the 6th rank. And as soon as the king comes into contact with the pawn, then the rook will just shift to the side where the king is not guarding, and then it'll start giving checks constantly. A good square to put the rook on is probably somewhere like f6, because then, well, you don't want your king to be blocking your rook from giving any checks. Like, say, if you bring the rook all the way to h6, after rook h7, there's no check, so you have to be a bit careful with that. So king d5, rook f6, king d4, let's say rook b6. You can't check the king when it's around 2 squares away from the rook, like in this example where you can't play rook f4 check, because after the simple king e5, this is lost. Here, if black were to play something like rook f6, then can you see how white wins this game? I encourage you to pause the video and try solving this. Okay, so the correct answer to this is the simple rook g8 check. And it's a deflection. The point is that after king takes g8, king takes f6, and the pawn is simply going to be queening in 2 moves. So rook f6 doesn't work, but neither does any other move. If something like rook b4 is played, then you can imagine that after check, king g6, rook b7, offering a trade of rook. You can't accept the trade of rooks, so you play rook to a4, getting behind this pawn. And now just a7 and the simple idea of bringing the king over to help defend the queening square is simple enough to win the game. So black has to start going for checks, and it's only supposed to be necessary when the king comes into contact with the pawn. If the king is maybe 3-4 squares away from the pawn, it's not necessary to check. Only when the king is closer to the pawn will it be necessary that you do that. Like in this example, where after king c5, rook f6, say a7. Now this is a drawn position, because after rook a6, we established that this is drawn, because if the king tries to come and defend the pawn, then we're just going to start checking it, and then when it comes back, like in this example, where after rook a1, let's say king b6, check, and the king tries to approach our rook, say like this. Then after king b2, we just put our rook back on a6, and yeah, that's basically it. I mean, what does white really have here? He can't advance his king forward, and he can't really do anything about this scenario. His rook cannot move, his king cannot move forward, so this is basically a drawn position. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.